All right, let's get us started this afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Scholar Talk event, Intellectual Journeys. I'm Tanya Stancil. I'm one of the board members for Intellect U Well. And for those of you who may not be familiar, Intellect U Well Inc. is a nonprofit organization here in Houston, Texas, that promotes reading, media literacy, digital citizenship, academic achievement, and self-improvement in the Houston, Texas community and beyond. Just a quick acknowledgement of our board members that we have on the call today. We have James Stancil, myself, Tanya Stancil. We have Davin Stancil, Mr. Tony Garrett, Dr. Justin Washington, and Mr. Pat Rump. Today, our Intellectual Journeys Scholar Talk theme is African Diaspora, with a focus on the experiences of African descendant peoples, both in the United States and abroad. So let me introduce our featured scholars for today's event. The first two scholars that we're going to hear from today are Ira Dworkin, who is the Associate Professor of English at Texas A&M University, and he specializes in African American and African diaspora literature, American literature and culture, race and ethnicity studies, and transnational literatures. And he's going to discuss his book, Congo Love Song, African American Culture and the Crisis of the Colonial State. Samuel Pardini is the Associate Professor of Italian in the Department of World Languages and Cultures at Elon University in North Carolina, and the author of In the Name of the Mother, Italian American, African American, and Modernity from Booker T. Washington to Bruce Springsteen, winner of the 2018 Italian American Studies Association Book Award, and he will discuss this work today. And then during our second panel, we will hear from Luis Duno-Gottberg, who is a professor of Caribbean and Film Studies at Rice University, and he specializes in 19th and 20th century Caribbean culture with emphasis on race and ethnicity, politics, and violence. He recently completed and will discuss his translation and annotated edition of ESTELA, the first Haitian novel. And Karl Jacoby is the Allen Nevins Professor of American History at Columbia University in New York and a specialist in environmental, borderlands, and Native American history. He will discuss his book, The Strange Career of William Ellis, the Texas slave who became a Mexican millionaire. So welcome to all of our scholars. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We're really looking forward to stimulating conversation with all of you. Today's moderator is James Stancil, who serves as the Chief Program Officer for Intellect U Well, and he's also a member of our Board of Directors. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to James, who will get us started with today's discussion.
All right, welcome everyone. So glad you all are here. This is our first Scholar Talk on this level virtually. We've always done these in person at Brazos Bookstore near Rice University. We'll be moving over to Geidt Gallery near Texas Southern University as soon as we get past this COVID situation. I've never tried this before, but can we somehow maybe do a virtual applause or something like that, like a round of applause or something for all these great scholars? There you go. I like that. Yeah, doing one of those, whatever the case may be. These scholars coming in from all over the country, and I know, looking at our registration, we have folk from Houston, California, France, the UK, all over the world, and the United States. And of course, if you know anything about the African diaspora, people usually say diaspora. They're talking about the Jewish diaspora, but for those of us who know history, we know there's an African diaspora as well, and we're all over everywhere. And so you're going to learn about some of those things today. Because we have four great scholars, and I guess full disclosure, these guys are all my friends. They're great guys. I love talking to them all. So I'm going to try to be as objective as I can here on this. But we've got four great scholars, so we're going to break them up into two sessions, as you heard my wife Tanya say there. But the scholars are going to be our second session. They're going to be a part of this first as well. So you may see them chime in and ask some questions and do some of those kind of things. So we'll get started. If any of you ever came to our book talks when we were at Brazos Bookstore, this is kind of free flowing and open. And this is an opportunity for you to talk with people about some of these subjects that you generally maybe wouldn't have access to or feel like you wouldn't have access to. You hear these brothers here when they talk, you're going to hear them basically tell you they love to talk to people about their work and to help and do those things in the communities, which is why they're here. But people sometimes feel like there's that ivory tower and they are so far distant, away. And the cool thing, there's not many cool things with the pandemic. One of the cool things is we can get Karl in from New York, and I have to fly him in this time. He can be still at home with his family. Same thing with Ira up at at A&M, Texas A&M, and Sam's out in North Carolina. We didn't have to fly them in. They could be here with us. And same for you all who enjoy listening to these kind of scholar discussions and participating. You can chime in from all over the world. This is going to be recorded, so you can review it on our YouTube channel, on our Intellect U Well page and things after the fact. So I want to make sure that everybody knows that this is going to be recorded, so you can share it, and everybody can be involved and engaged. I guess, Tanya, you can tell us the ground rules of how we're going to do the discussion, and we'll get started. Generally, I guess we're going to wait till maybe the end for people to ask some questions. Is that how we're going to do this, Tanya?
Yeah, I would say if you'd like to put a question in the chat, I'll be monitoring the chat, and I can help maybe kind of see those questions when we have a chance. But certainly at the end, we'll also leave time for questions.
Right. End meaning the end of the first session, not the end of everything.
Yes.
And then at the end of the second session, we'll tell you about some of our upcoming events and some of those kind of things. We'll have a short break in the middle as well. So if you need to go to the restroom or whatever the case may be, and maybe we'll have some time for some crosstalk there as well. All right. Are the people ready?
Yep.
All right, Luis, Brother Karl, y'all ready? All right. So let's go ahead on and get started here. And I just have some general questions that I ask, and these guys know this is informal. This is not like one of those professor kind of things, because this what we do with Intellect U Well is we want to bring the scholarship to the people and let you know that guys like Karl and Luis are regular guys, and they do great work. And these are some things that you can do if you're interested as well. I mean, we can never be a Karl Jacoby or Luis Duno-Gottberg, but we can do some things that in our community. So let's start with you, Karl. Can you tell us a little bit about your background that you want to share? How you got into scholarship, how you got into this field, anything else that you want to share, so folk can kind of get a feel for you.
Sure. I think the quickest way to get into that is I do borderlands history, which is basically kind of the history of the U.S.-Mexico border. And I think one of the main things that gets people into scholarship is the fact that the sense that there's an absence, that there's something that you're aware of in your life that you really can't make sense of. And so you want to try to figure out for yourself, write the book that in essence you can't find. And my grandparents had relocated to Mexico when I was a little kid, and I used to spend a lot of my time going back and forth across the border from Arizona into Sonora as a kid. And so I really got interested in this issue of crossing the border, and there was very little literature on that. And so I eventually, in trying to make sense of it, I ended up going to graduate school. And I think that's what really drew me to the story that I wrote about in the book that you mentioned, The Strange Career of William Ellis, because this is someone who grew up in Victoria, not far from Houston, on a cotton plantation, and then ends up crossing the border into Mexico and back into Texas. And he's really on a much more extreme level, doing that migration back and forth across the border from Mexico and the U.S. And really sort of casts into sharp relief all of the issues involved. So that's a very quick introduction.
That's pretty good, Karl. Yes, William Ellis, AKA, and hopefully I'm saying this correctly. I talked with this with some of our mentees in here in Houston a lot. Guillermo Eliseo. How's that, Karl?
That's good.
Yes, also known as Guillermo Eliseo.
Yeah.
So we'll get a little bit more into that story. But I wanted to give Luis an opportunity as well to kind of talk about his background a little bit. And some of this may be new to me, Luis. How did you get into scholarship, becoming an academic and a researcher, and kind of what motivates you?
So I'm originally from Caracas, from Venezuela, but the son of children of a family of the 60s. Being born in Venezuela doesn't mean that I was able to stay in Venezuela. We had to move a lot in the 70s, so experienced different forms of exile. So even though I was born in Venezuela, I live in Chile, and then we live in Canada, in Montreal. I started studying medicine in Venezuela, and very early on, I was kind of running away from politics, and eventually did full circle, quit med school, and went into the humanities. I couldn't run away from that, right? And there were a series of incidents, things that were, as Karl said, those things are part of your life, really speak to your scholarship. Even though my parents were very progressive or lefty, I discovered that even in that environment, there were deep contradictions, especially when you talk about race issues. So my grandmother was of Italian origins, first generation in Venezuela, from southern Italy, married to un sambo, right? His father was black, her mother was indigenous. But so she was a brown woman, right? And my grandfather was too. And I would hear sometimes the Italian grandmother making comments about race that I found disconcerting, right? Because I was like, what, do you look your husband? Like that's your husband, right? And that's the child, my father too. Those things were naturalized, right? So those things were lingering there, and as I switched from med school to humanities and tried to run away from these conversations, they just pop up. So I decided to start doing scholarship on race in the Caribbean. Funny enough, I didn't start studying Venezuela until later. I did my first book on Cuban relation and on Cuba and race relations from the 19th to the 20th century. Kind of deconstructing, questioning discourses of miscegenation and mestizaje, and then I moved into other parts of the Caribbean. So I've done Venezuela eventually, but I start I guess even in my scholarship, I was trying to run away from home and the topics that were too close, right? Mm-hmm. The topic of Haiti that we're going to talk about later today fell in my hands by chance, and I can talk about that later if you want, how I got to that particular research. So that's kind of my journey into these topics.
Yeah. And see, I didn't know. I told y'all I learned something new. I didn't know you had that Italian background.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Delle Piani.
Yeah, I saw Brother Sam Pardini, who's been talking about those connections. I saw him kind of perk up when you said that. And that's great. And I got a little feedback.
I couldn't hear you very well. Sorry.
Okay. We okay now? Okay.
Oh.
Okay. But what I was going to say is, Luis mentioned his study of Haiti, and that's when we first met. We were doing the 100 Black Men of Metropolitan Houston project. Of course, we do an event every year here in Houston, 100 Links to Africa, and he was involved with us the first year as a Haitian scholar. Talking about the history of Haiti and the rest of the history. We've developed a very good relationship. So that's awesome. And he writes about all different things that you can, same with Karl. Both they have a long scholarship list of things that, and we'll get into that a little bit later. You can talk about some of your other works, Karl and Luis, in addition to what we're going to talk about today. But great work from both of these gentlemen and all kinds of different topics. And it's really, of course, really interesting to me, as a historian as well and a media studies person. So you've already talked a little bit about Karl and Luis, your kind of, well, at least Karl, you did a little bit about your motivations for your work, and specifically this book. Can you just kind of talk more about how you found out about William Ellis, Guillermo Ellis? I love saying that, Karl. Guillermo Ellis, how you found out about him and why you were interested in doing that work with him. And you've gotten a lot of critical acclaim, a lot. book awards and everything, so congratulations to you on that, for doing that. And then Luis, I'll ask you this, same question about the first Haitian novel, which I kind of gave it away a little bit. But y'all can each kind of tell us a little bit about why you were interested in those works. And then also, I'll add on to that, how long did it take for you to do this? That's something that's always really interesting. People think you can just churn these books out just like that, right? And what type of research methods do you use? Go ahead, Karl, we'll start with you.
All right. So to answer the second question first, it took me about 10 years to write this book. And one of the reasons it took me so long is so I was writing about this figure, someone who was born enslaved in Victoria, Texas, and then, his birth name was William Ellis. And then, as James was saying, he kind of reinvents himself as a Mexican, crosses a border and reinvents himself as a Mexican and calls himself Guillermo de Seo. And so the real paradox at the heart of the book and why it took me so long is that you're trying to write the life story of someone who's trying to hide his life story. This is a story of someone who is trying to conceal a lot of the details of his life, particularly because at the time when he lived in Texas in the latter half of the 19th century, in doing some of the things he was doing, it could be quite dangerous to be identified as African American. So the how I fell into this story is really kind of interesting. When I was in graduate school, one of my advisors knew I was interested in the border, and so she said, "There's some of these records by the State Department no one's really looked at. Why don't you go look at these and just write a little short paper?" And so in many ways, this is a cautionary tale about the short paper that turns into 10 years of my life. And so I was looking at, there were records from consuls in northern Mexico, and they're super boring at first. I was like, there's nothing in here. And then I flipped the page, and there was, the consuls are writing that there's hundreds of African-American sharecroppers from Alabama and Georgia, and they're running around northern Mexico, Coahuila, Mexico. And I was like, what's going on? Because whenever we talk about migration between the US and Mexico, we always talk about Mexicans coming to the United States. We never think about the reverse. Why would someone from the United States want to go to Mexico? This is happening in 1895, so you got to think it's right after Plessy versus Ferguson. It's really as Jim Crow is really solidifying in the United States, and there is no Jim Crow in Mexico. And there's lots of reasons when you start, it's not that hard to really pin down why African Americans would actually find Mexico a really intriguing place to be at this time period. And what got me interested in it was just, how had this happened and how had I never heard about large numbers of African Americans? It was close to 1,000 in this particular incident going to Mexico in this way. And then I got really interested in the person who was behind this effort. And it was this shadowy figure known as Guillermo de Seo, William Ellis. There were a lot of names and a lot of stories. He was Mexican, he was Cuban, he was maybe from Texas. And it took me a long, long time to track it down. And really the only way that I could do it was going outside of the standard archive and eventually tracking down his family members on both sides of the border and interviewing them and doing oral histories and really kind of getting the real history from them and then understanding the persona that he was creating, which was in many ways what you see in the press, and then understanding the real family and the real history behind that.
Wow.
I could go on forever, but that's a pretty good place to stop right now.
No, that's perfectly fine, Karl. Yeah, I mean, I just find it very fascinating, and we'll talk about, a little bit, in case I think you can mention the fact that, your work has been Hollywood and, other media outlets are interested in telling this story. We can kind of get into that a little bit. I still think that would be a great movie. And if it does come to pass, if I can just get a little small cameo or something,
Yeah, I would love for them to film it, part of it in Victoria, actually, which is, obviously where his story starts. So that, we'll work you in. But it's a long road. There's nothing definite about Hollywood yet. So
yes. If you need somebody to play one of the runaway enslaved Africans that early on or something, I got that one. So, Brother Luis, how about you? How did you get into this work with ESTELA?
In that time, my scholarship was centered in Cuba, And the connections between Cuba and Haiti are super important. Everybody knows about those connections and the influence of the Haitian Revolution all over the hemisphere, right? But I wasn't doing archival work on Haiti, but doing work on Cuba when a friend of mine told me about a now famous book that had come out and made some references to ESTELA. And he mentioned that the author, I'm not going to mention it because it's someone very prestigious, hadn't read the novel, but referenced the novel in the book. There was no way to reference this book unless you had gone to the archive, and something was funny about the reference. So I was doing research in the University of Florida, and they had the manuscript. This novel, then, I'm talking about over 10 years ago, was only in France and in some some photographic, forgot how to say that in English. When you have pictures of the document, what do you call that?
I know what you're talking about. Microfilm?
Microfilm, yes. So it's the same in Spanish. I should have said it in Spanish. And so they had those microfilms, and so I went and requested access to the work and started reading it. And my friend told me, like, you know what? Why don't you translate that? And it's this novel about it's a foundational novel. It's about the origins of the Haitian nation, and you have a black and a brown Haitian coming together to fund the nation. And at that time, my scholarship on Cuba was kind of suspect of those narrative of brotherhood, where you have brotherhood but to eliminate black, right? So here I have a narrative that you have everybody coming together, right? Seems like a very romantic, harmonious call for brotherhood, but it has its contradictions, right? It's a brotherhood that it has some level of ethnic lynching. That was my reading for the case of Cuba, and then when I read the novel, said like there's something like that here. Plus, it's a novel that is nobody has access to it, so it would be a great document also to learn about the foundation of the Haitian nation and the contradictions of nation building and the complexities of race relations in the Caribbean, right? And so I was able to get a copy of the document, left aside what I was doing, and start translating very slowly. It was a very difficult project because just deciding the right tone in French. The novel in French has a very flourish language. And the structures are certainly not conducive to the structure of the English language. So at that time, I started translating in Spanish. So I did both books, one in Spanish that was published in Venezuela by Biblioteca Ayacucho, and then this other publication that I work with, a graduate student of mine who did the work of translating. She's an English speaker. And at some point it was beautiful because we would have the two texts, the French text, the Spanish text, and the English text, and we will debate. And it took about a couple of years. Once we had finished the translations, maybe another year of discussions and debates on how to. So the texts are very different. For the Spanish translation, kind of captures the structures of French, the kind of a little flourished language, whereas the English translation is a little more direct. It took a long time, and then finding the publishers. I would think that people would jump at it because it's a foundational novel. It's the first novel ever written in Haiti, 1858, 59. Poetry was more common in writing, but not novels. But it took a little bit of time to find the publisher. That's the story of the book.
Yeah. So years, right? For both of you.
Yeah. Total, I think it was about 5 to 6 years.
Right.
Because I also work in many things at the same time. Right. And because I tell my kids that I transform a problem, a defect, into a virtue. Like I'm scattered. Well, I work here, do this, and then do that,
multitask.
Several things done. So I use that to carry out several projects at the same time.
Right.
But it was a lot of work. Translating is an undervalued work in the academia too. So that's another conversation, you know.
Yeah. And I was just going to say, Luis, I know we have some folk on the call who are. Yeah, we got a little feedback again. But I know we have some folk on the call who are interested in becoming academic scholars and researchers as well. So they may have some specific questions to ask you about that. But it doesn't just kind of stop. Okay, is that better? Yeah, we still haven't. I'm not sure where that's coming from. Tanya, can you make sure everybody is everybody muted?
Yes, go ahead and continue. Let's see if it. Oh.
All right, well, I'll just continue. I was going to say, those who have those questions about becoming scholars and those kind of things, you can ask that as well. All right, so let me kind of move on. Yeah, that's kind of killing me here. Can you kind of tell us, gentlemen, and we'll start with you again, Karl, what can readers expect? You know, what are some, you know, if you can kind of give us, some tidbits of what can they expect when they pick up this book, some highlights.
Oh, well, I think the main thing I'd say about the book is that I tried to write it in many respects like a novel. And I tried to do it for that reason because when I was writing this, I was reading a lot of novels from the Harlem Renaissance, almost all of which deal with the question of passing in one way or another. I mean, Nella Larsen's Passing, which is folks know is just being turned into a movie, is sort of the most famous example. But it really is present in almost every novel from the Harlem Renaissance. So I tried to write the book in as story-like a way as possible, while at the same time making it history in the way of trying to show you the different ways that race was conceptualized in Mexico versus in the United States. And I think the larger point that I'm trying to make at this point is we often say, gee, isn't it interesting? Mexico has a somewhat different, fairly different racial system where they really stress mestizaje. The sort of mixing in Mexico and the United States really stresses segregation and this idea of this fantasy of racial purity. And what I really felt writing this book is in the 19th century it's not an accident that they come up, that both countries are really constructing their racial systems in opposition to one another. And so the United States is often presenting Mexico as this example of racial mixing and all the horrors and the political instability they think will result from it. And on the other hand, Mexico is looking across the border in horror at the United States and its segregation and its treatment of ethnic Mexicans and its treatment of African Americans and the lynch law that operates in the United States, and really trying quite consciously not to be like that nation. And then what's really interesting is William Ellis is moving back and forth and trying to figure out how to situate himself in these two racial systems. So he's the same person, but he becomes racially different depending on which side of the border he's on. So it's I like to think it's kind of a history, that it's also a mystery, that's also kind of like an adventure, but you learn a little bit along the way.
Right, Karl. And I was thinking specifically about like the train ride, you know, that you wrote about, and if you want to.
No, that's a great point. I mean, the opening scene actually, I think, is one of the train. The train becomes a motif in the book because actually if you think about it, so Plessy versus Ferguson, right? The infamous court case that sort of declares separate but equal. It's set on a train, and that a lot of the train is this new technology. It puts people in really close proximity to one another, and so all these issues about, you know, who you're sitting next to and race really become pronounced on the train. The train also becomes the device that enables people to pass, as it were, because you can't, in your birth community, pass. Because, you know, everyone knows who your family is, but you can, once the train comes in after the Civil War into the South, and you can move to a different community. That's what William Ellis does. He's born in Victoria, and then he moves to San Antonio originally, and in San Antonio he he changes his identity, and he's listed in the census information as Mexican. And so he's able through the train to change his identity. The really tricky point about all this, and it's what I use to open the book up as an opening scene, is so when he's traveling between the US and Mexico, there's this moment of transition. So in Mexico, the trains are not segregated. He's on the first class train because he's a very sort of elegant figure. He's in the first class Pullman car in Mexico. And then when you cross the border into Texas, of course, there's Jim Crow in Texas. And there becomes this whole question of when you cross the border, what race are you? What train car can you sit in? And so it shows how when you cross the border, the whole issue about race then comes to the foreground, right? And also he has to figure out how to negotiate this really fraught situation of what he can do on one side of the border and then how he has to present himself on the other side of the border to make sure that he's, safe.
Yeah, I mean, that train thing, it just kind of stuck with me, and, it makes me think about the double consciousness, ideal that, African Americans, kind of have in the United States. But wanted to at least kind of give people a taste of that, because that's definitely something, Carl, that really stuck with me as a Black male. I guess I would be what would I be in Spanish? Is James, Luis? Would I be Jaime? James?
Santiago. James is Santiago.
Oh, Santiago. So I'll be Santiago Stancil, something. I remember that. I'm now going to be Santiago. Luisa, what can we expect? I think maybe a lot of folks on the Zoom maybe know about the Haitian Revolution. Some may not, but this is a kind of a novelized, version of it. So, kind of give us some tidbits. Yeah, what can we expect when we pick it up?
So the novel is a short novel that tells the story of two brothers. One, both slaves. One is they're both the children of a female slave. One is the son of the slave master, and the other of an African man. So they're half brothers. So the novel is to be read as an allegory. The name of one is Romulo and the other is Remo. So you may think of those foundational narratives of Rome, but in this case is the foundational narrative of the Haitian nation. Those two children, descendant of slaves, one of descendant of the violence of the white enslavers, and the other of an African, have to come together to be able to form a functional family / nation, right? Which is what a nation is supposed to be, in theory. Throughout the novel, you will see the appearance of actual characters from the Haitian Revolution, historical characters. So it's an intertwining of fiction and historical narrative, some quite accurate. So the novel tells the story, and the first thing that readers could find is the Haitian Revolution itself, which is a historical event that has been erased from history because it's unthinkable that African slave would defeat the French, the British, the Spanish, right? An army of slaves doing this kind of thing, and the explanation doesn't reside exclusively in the yellow fever, as the French annals try to state. More Ira probably can speak to this, is in the Congo Wars and military knowledge of these African soldiers who knew how to fight. So from that angle, it's fascinating to read the novel and find things that pertain to guerrilla tactics. I remember reading parts of the novel and said, this is the things that I found in Che Guevara diaries. You have those things there. You have, again, the historical figures and the conflicts between the figures. So it has a great value in that sense in showing a part of history that has been erased in the hemisphere, right? In fact, the fact that this novel that is so important hadn't been published until I did this translation. There's a second translation now in English, published by NYU, and the sole translation in Spanish is the one I did. So it's inexplicable that book hasn't circulated more. It is. We understand. It's erased because it's Haiti, right? Because it's unthinkable. It's very threatening, the idea that slaves and blacks can achieve that success. So that's one element. The other element that is more complex and interesting in the novel, once you read it a couple of times, you can think about the contradictions of founding these nations in the Caribbean. Because the novel, in another level, entails other erasures through this romance of blacks and mulattoes, right? And I'm using here Michel Trouillot's Silencing of the Past on Haiti. He speaks about how some historical narratives of Haiti kind of erase the African element, right? And ESTELA, the name of the novel, is nonetheless than a white female that appears in the novel to guide the brothers. So what is behind this idea that a white female figure representing civilization, European civilization, in my opinion, is to guide the formation of the Haitian nation? So that kind of raises some flags to me in terms of the contradictions of the foundational of the nation. And if you know about Haitian history, you will know that there is this historical conflict since 19th century between Noirism, the celebration of black African traditions, and the mulattoes, right? And that expressed itself not only in cultural discourses, but in political formations, in political parties, and actual conflict. And it reached all the way to Duvalier and Papadoc and Babydoc and so forth. Quite complex. But this simple novel gives you insight into all these levels of the formation of Haiti and the contradictions of that nation.
Wow.
So I find it fascinating.
Yeah, I think so. But people need to, of course, realize this is a fictionalized version,
right?
It's not a historical piece. And also, I think it's really important that we talk about enslaved Africans as opposed to slaves, enslaved people, because let's make sure we use people first terminology. I think Brother Terrence mentioned that, and I try to always do that, Terrence. I try to mention enslaved Africans versus just slaves. When I came through school, people say, "Oh, the slaves." No, they weren't slaves. They weren't born slaves. They were enslaved. They were
exactly.
They were enslaved Africans. All right, good stuff. I just want to make sure we have some time for some questions as well and comments from our folk in attendance. And also I want to give you two a chance to maybe kind of ask each other some questions. So just briefly, what do you think was the biggest surprise, maybe the biggest reward, or the biggest challenge, just as briefly as you can, from each of your works? We'll start with you, Karl, and then we'll open it up, Tanya, for some questions from the audience.
I would say the biggest surprise and one of the nicest benefits of doing this work is, as I mentioned earlier, the only way I could really do it was not by looking at what the archive was telling me, but by going outside the archive and tracking down William Ellis, Guillermo Eliseo's family and interviewing them. And, they had really cool photos too. So the photo on the cover, for instance, is one of the photos that they had, that the family had really kept a lot of these stories alive. And, I didn't really know what the family would be like at the end of my journey when I finally tracked them down, but they were just on both sides of the border. They were really lovely people. The two sides of the family had lost touch with one another, the U.S. and the Mexican side of the family, and so I was able to reunite them. And so you sometimes wonder as a scholar, sort of like, what am I doing? And we hear a lot about, divided families now, families that are divided by the border. And in a very small way, this is one family that was divided by the border that I was able to help reunite, and they were able to come back together. And they're actually really good friends now. So when William Ellis's great-granddaughter got married in Mexico about a year or two ago, I went down with some of the U.S. side of the family. It's interesting. So the Mexican side of the family identifies as Mexican, and the U.S. side of the family identifies as African American. I went down with some of the African American side of the family, and we all went to the wedding together. It was a lot of fun. And so, I have a new set of friends because of this particular intellectual journey. And really, the last thing I did actually before I COVID hit us is William Ellis was born in Victoria, and they were doing their first sort of book festival in Victoria in, I want to say, early March of 2020. And so I went there, and with some of the family members, I insisted that they bring some of the family members as well. And so we gave a talk about William Ellis in his hometown, which was sort of great. We felt like we were bringing William Ellis back to Victoria. And then I've also gotten to know the person who currently owns the plantation where William Ellis used to live, where his ancestors were enslaved. And so I was able to take the family members there, and that was a very powerful moment for them to get to see the place where their family had lived. So those are just sort of unexpected results of writing the book. And I think it's more the and I got to meet you too, James. I guess I got to meet you when I spoke at Brazos Books the first time. So, all these connections at the book, it's an odd process because you spend an awful lot of time alone by yourself in the library researching or writing, but then the book becomes this opportunity also to meet all sorts of new people, and that's really special and powerful.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm gonna let you jump in there, Luis, but before I forget, I'm kind of getting a little gray, so I want to make sure I mention Karl. And Tony, Brother Tony, I don't know if your wheels are turning there too, but that sounds like a intellectual. We do nature by the book, where we go out to places and and discuss stuff. Maybe we should work out something where we go to that plantation and read your book, Karl, and we can go to that that plantation. We'll talk about that offline, but especially if you have the connection with the owner now, that would be cool. My mind's wheels always turning there, Brother Tony. The wheels always turning. So yeah, Luis, briefly, if you can kind of answer that question as well, and then we're gonna open up the questions. I'm gonna let my lovely wife take it from there.
One of the things that is unexpected, again, perhaps not, because these things are unexpected, and then you remember the history and realize that these horrors are part of that history, right? But when you read the novel, you realize that it's very clear and very firm about the horrors of slavery and the abuses of the French. The French in the novel come across as what they were, right? Enslavers and people who devote all their energy and resources and power to oppress and extract labor and dehumanize other human beings. So that part is not unexpected. What to me was unexpected is to see that in this narrative about the horrors of slavery, the author would reproduce some elements of the ideology of the enslavers. And that's more complex and more interesting to me. And I guess this connects with my scholarship in Cuba, right? When I saw it, I recognized it immediately. This is a discourse that I can even connect it with populist narratives in which, you represent different identities as cohesive, but just because you want to diffuse conflict to achieve something else. So that to me was unexpected in a way and very productive. Because also it speaks to this very acute conflict in Haitian history between the mulatto and the blacks, right? And here you have a novel fictionalizing that conflict. And again, I think the key element there in symbolic terms was this image of ESTELA, this female blonde, who would appease the brothers when they come into conflict, right? As if the European ideals of the Enlightenment were to appease conflict when slavery and violence derive from the traditions of the Enlightenment, right? So that was an important finding for me.
Okay. Great, thank you. What do y'all think so far? Y'all learning a few things? It's pretty interesting. Can we do one of those rounds of applause there again a little bit? Yeah, I like that better there. Sister, I think it's Tania. Did I pronounce that right, Tania? I like how she did the hand. Okay.
Yeah, it's Taninia.
Oh, Tania, I was close.
And I work at an elementary school, and so that's what we do at the elementary school.
Oh, I love it, Tania. Okay, I had to look twice. My wife have kind of similar hair there a little bit and similar names. All right. Okay, Miss Tanya, if you could lead us through some questions, at least ones that people have submitted via chat. I know Brother Terrence got a few things to say. I've been following him through the chat. But Tanya, we'll start with that, and then we'll let people kind of speak directly to Karl and Luis. And I'll be quiet if I talk too much.
Okay, yes. We have one question for Karl, and you may have addressed this question already a bit, but I'll go ahead and ask it and see if there's anything you want to add. How did William Ellis's name change and migration change the future generations for his family? And then also, how did the family embrace or reject your research? Were there any dynamics that you discovered that surprised you?
Oh, those are great questions. So one of the things that's really interesting about the 19th century is this is an era before most people have birth certificates and before most people have passports and before most people have driver's license, because of course there's no cars. So in essence, there's very little documentation in terms of proving who you are as a piece of paper that does it, and you have to in essence prove it through your performance of that identity. And so it was not very complicated to change his name from William Ellis to Guillermo Eliseo, because you just show up in a new town and say, I'm Guillermo Eliseo, and people either believe you or not. And he spoke fluent Spanish and would dress in a certain way that implied he was of Mexican descent, and people generally believed him. And so it was really just in the performance. There was no real need to, go to the courthouse and change your name legally or anything like that. And then in terms of the sort of the families, so one thing that really I was not alert to this initially, but I eventually picked up on it. The William Ellis marries a white woman, in part, I think, because he wanted to have children, and the whole question of when you're passing, if you have children, you have to be very conscious of what they look like. And I think he selected the lightest, she's very blonde, so he selected sort of the lightest person he could. But when his family eventually moves to Mexico, his immediate family, and the other U.S. side of the family was his nieces and nephews, that side of the family. And when I finally was able to make contact and we were arranging to get back in touch, they were excited, but on the other hand, they were a little bit anxious. I think the African American side of the family was anxious because in essence, several generations ago, the William Ellis's immediate family had in essence passed for white and just kind of turned their back on their black relatives, which again is one of the sort of really sort of tragic costs of passing, right? As you cut yourself off from the community, cut yourself off from family members. And so they were very anxious about how that reapproachment might work, whether they would be greeted enthusiastically or not. And one of the other things that was quite surprising, so the U.S. side of the family knew about William Ellis's efforts to sort of, chameleon-like change his identity, his ethnic identity. The Mexican side didn't, so that my Spanish is pretty fluent. I'm not bilingual though, and so I'm trying to explain to William Ellis's grandson, what his grandfather, who he always thought was British, was actually African American, and they had to basically, that was also something that they hadn't really expected when they were finally meeting their U.S. side, their long lost relatives. So it seems to have worked out really well, but there was a lot of initial sort of, I think, surprise on both sides about what this was going to be like, and it made me realize that this is not going to be just perhaps the sort of easy family reunion that I had imagined. That there are definite things to be negotiated here. It looks like Luis wants to add something.
Karl, sorry, I'm fascinated with this story because it talks about all these discourses that are problematic in Latin America, right? There's this desire of whitening all the time. And I thought of a poem by Cuban poet Nicolás Guillén called El Abuelo.
Mm-hmm.
The grandfather. And it's all about this. Everybody has a grandfather that is black, right? But you don't want to show your grandfather. So the whole poem develops in this narrative in which you know that there's a grandfather there in the living room or in the kitchen, but you don't want it to come out because you don't want to reveal that we all have that African blood in Latin America, and especially in the Caribbean. So
Henry Louis Gates' book addresses that. Blacks in Latin America. He talks about the grandma in the closet, abuelito.
Yeah, it's particularly interesting. In Mexico has its own variation because Mexico talks about itself as a mestizo nation, and mestizo means mixed. But the way it's conceptualized in Mexico is generally Spanish and Indian. And so they've really, in many ways, there are a lot of Afro-Mexicanos. I mean, there's actually a very substantial Afro-Mexicano presence in Mexico, but it's something that's completely erased from the national discourse and the ideology of mestizaje. So they, on one level, Mexicans are a little more honest about admitting that we're mixed, but on the other hand, they're actually covering up one of the very significant aspects of where that mixture comes from, which is from African descended people.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Carl, because I talked to a lot of my students at Prairie View A&M about that point right there. Costa Chica, is that?
Costa Chica, yeah, that's in Oaxaca, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's an area where they have, and Henry Louis Gates visited there, the PBS documentary, he visited there as well. I was wanting to make sure I got that name correct for those who are interested in doing that, kind of researching that. Okay, Tanya, we have some more questions, or we want to let some folk, ask these gentlemen?
I do not see any other questions in the chat. So if anyone else has a question they'd like to ask, go ahead and unmute yourself so you can ask your question.
Well, I don't have a question. I have more of a statement, if that's okay, and maybe others can speak to it. But this whole topic reminds me of a extremely long crime scene. When we're talking about these issues, looking at it from the perspective, as I mentioned in the chat, of the criminal, of the violator, then language begins to change. The so-called slave, as one might say, was the victim of slavery. If somebody is raped or murdered today, you do not call them the victim, And so I'm looking at this in the same way. When I look at these sort of stories, I'm looking at it once again from the perspective of who was the violator. Whose rap sheet are we talking about? And changing perspectives again, as opposed to the focus being on the person, on the victim that the crime happened to. And I think that's
Africans.
Exactly. I think that's a much more intelligent and right way of looking at it. If that makes any sense.
It does. Terrence, can you tell us where you're coming from? I mean, I know where you're coming from in terms of intellectually, but like what location you're coming from?
Chicago.
All right. Thank you for chiming in, bro.
Thank you.
I like to jump in. I totally agree with. I couldn't see the video, so I cannot see your face here. But I think you're totally right. Language matters. Language is not just ornamental. Language does do things, right? And in this particular novel is an example of that. It's this novel is written by a mulatto writer, intellectual, who was at odds with what in the 20th century we like the Noirist faction. And you feel sometimes in the language of the novel that there is this hidden animosity towards Africa. There is this notion of Africa as being a primitive, area, territory or cultures that had to be left behind, which I find quite contradictory because, again, as I mentioned, it was African knowledge that allow people first to defeat the French, the British, and the Spanish, military knowledge from the Congo Wars, but also survive, eating, medicine, health, there is a whole, so it's interesting because even though the author tries to do this, when they describe certain things, you realize that they are portraying a knowledge that is not an European knowledge, it's an African knowledge. So language does violence, but language also registers contradictions because you cannot escape recognizing those legacies from Africa. It seems like I'm saying bad things about the novel. I think the novel has contradictions that the formation of these nations have, like this nation,
Right, like
and it's
everywhere.
interesting to find those violences there.
Nothing is perfect. The United States is not perfect. The whole idea of form a more perfect union. So I think we understand what you're saying there. Go ahead, Brother Carl.
I just wanted one point in response to Terrence's comments, which I thought were really well taken, is that one of the first reviews actually of the book when it came out of my book, and it called William Ellis a con man. And I ended up contacting the reviewer and saying, well, this sort of casting of William Ellis as sort of a con man or as a quasi-criminal is really, I think, the wrong approach to take, because basically the real crime at this time period is Jim Crow. And the fact that someone would be trying to perhaps manipulate how they're seen by whites to get ahead a little bit is not really the crime that we should be focusing in on. The crime to focus in on is the greater crime of Jim Crow and white supremacy. Like that's really what the book is designed to point out.
Absolutely, that's great, Carl. Wow. And I'll just mention this briefly. As we go through, y'all, there's a little button up there, I think, a little star. So if you want to add some highlights to our video or something like that, it's like you chime in. It's almost like on social media, like a yes or, or like a thumbs up or something like that. You can do that. Brother Terrence, do you want to make one last comment, Brother Terrence, before we transition? I saw you put it in the chat. You can say it out loud if you want to.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, also, connected with language, of course, is psychology. When you're trying to look at a person, or it's easy to look at a person, if a person is, let's say, perhaps enslaving another human being or killing another human being or doing some kind of crime or act of violence or whatever it may be, that can also be an entry into looking at that individual's psychology, and calling that person whatever you might want to call them or label them using names and language once again, also looking at histories. From that standpoint, we can kind of go back and we can begin looking at the psychology, looking at the history that has led up to using certain language. So once again, the focus being on the doer as opposed to the victim. And the more we learn about the perpetrator, the more we understand, the situation that was happening, like slavery. Like, for instance, if we're going to talk about slavery, we have to look at the psychology of the slaver and some of the history behind it as well, as opposed to concentrating and focusing much more on the victim, because it just doesn't make sense to do it that way. And oftentimes that piece is left out. It's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, Terrence, I love that. And I saw you smile a little bit. So, when he said that as well. So, Terrence, I hope you can stay for our second session, because I think you're going to want to hear some of the things we talk about there as well. And Terrence, let me just ask you just briefly, are you familiar with the field of whiteness studies?
A little bit, maybe.
Yeah, because that's kind of what they do with whiteness studies. You may want to look into that a little bit. They look at some of those things. And Neil Irwin Painter, who was, I won't get into that, but she was at UNC when I was an undergrad, but that's a whole other matter. But she's got a book called The History of Whiteness. And there's, multiple kind of books on those topics. Terrence, I think you might be interested. And we could talk offline about that too, Terrence. I can give you some good references. I'm sure Carl and Luis probably could as well. But there are some folk out there studying that subject, Terrence. And you're absolutely right. You have to understand the psychology of the oppressor, as well as the situation and the status of the oppressed. Right?
And one last thing, the reason why I say that as being important is because it has never left us. It still happens today. Absolutely. When you look at crimes and imprisonment and racism and all these kinds of things that are offshoots of that, it's the same thing with that. Today a lot of times the focus is looked on the one who is quote unquote committing the crime as opposed to what created the situation. And if one tries to do that, maybe as it was back in the past or all throughout, then it's looked at as giving excuses for what we have in the present day. So we have to look at the history, we have to look at the psychology, and we have to look at the information inside of what created the whole situation. And I think that that's more of an approach to justice.
That's great stuff, Terrence. Thank you so much for your contributions. I've been reading everything you've been saying in the chat. I wanted to make sure we gave you a chance to, for those who couldn't see it, maybe say some things out loud. So thank you for that. I know we're Tanya. I know we're a little bit over here, so we're gonna take a break. Get ready to go to our next session. I'll let Tanya kind of take over. But one more hand for Brother Karl and Brother Luis here. Hopefully y'all learned a lot, during this session here. And I don't know if Karl and Luis, if y'all are able to kind of stay for our second session. People may, if you can, I would love it. You can ask some questions, and maybe people could catch you at the end. And of course, you all are open, Karl, Luis, if people want to email you or reach out to you. I'll let you tell them orally just so they can say it, because people don't believe me when I say scholars and writers are open. I always have to, make sure y'all say it so they can know they can contact you directly, right?
Of course. I'm very easy to find on Google. If you just Google my name and Columbia University, you can always find me.
All right. Columbia University in New York.
Yeah.
Ivy League school, right? Because there's another one as well. Luis?
Yeah, first, thank you for the opportunity to share with all of you. It's a pleasure. It's, in COVID and even within the academia, we're isolated. So it's a pleasure to exchange ideas with all of you. And yes, anything that you may need, I'm happy to share readings, conversations. My email is super easy. It's luis@rice.edu. And like Karl, you can find me if you Google my name also, or you go to Rice. I'm more than happy to share and to support initiatives related to these topics. So
right. And Luis and I have something. We have a research project, Terrence. You may be interested in that. We work on together. We won't talk about it right now. But yeah, you can reach him at Rice, and Karl is at Columbia. All right, Kaya, let me stop talking right now so you can do your thing.
Yes. Okay. We're going to take a 10-minute break before we start our next panel, so everyone can stretch your legs and grab something to drink or just take a break. So we'll be back. We'll start the next panel at 4:20. So we'll give you 12 minutes. Okay?
Don't go anywhere.
Come back.
You can go. Yeah, come back. Go somewhere, but come back. So we got Brother Ira and Brother Sam, and they've got some great topics for you as well.
Okay. Right. Thank you, everybody. See you soon.
Okay. Thank you.